So hi, I'm Nathanael. As Marie said, I am now the Deputy Director in the Research Department at FCDO. And I've worked for about 20 years on this kind of question about how do you get evidence-informed policy making into practice. But my last job before this was 4 years in Nepal, where I made a kind of deliberate decision to do a much more kind of generalist delivery leadership role. So I thought I'd talk about that a bit, about my experience of being on the dark side of international development. So what I thought was important there in Nepal was, actually, as you were saying, Santiago, how can we go from a kind of, actually, you know, in what was then DFID, quite a lot of programme evaluations, thinking much more about a kind of portfolio approach to understanding the collective impact of what we are, what the UK is working with in Nepal on international development. So I'll just draw out three quick kind of lessons from that. The first was that the sort of political economy of decision making was really important, much more than the kind of evidence use and uptake was really understanding how decisions get made about UK funding in Nepal. And that happens at lots of different levels. So there's a kind of ministerial level, there's a kind of leadership in Nepal, but then there's also the sort of day-to-day of how program managers decide where stuff gets implemented, how data is collected on those. And I think that for me was quite insightful in terms of often the incentives didn't really lie with better programming. I mean, obviously, better programming is what, you know, and the kind of making sure that we were delivering with Nepal the priorities they wanted, right? Fine. But actually, what are the other incentives that people have? And certainly as someone in a leadership position, like, you know, what gets recognised, what gets praised, to some extent also kind of how decisions are made about promotion, right? And kind of just the sort of nuts and bolts of jobs. But also then how are people, how collectively did we as a group of people working in Nepal want to be seen both by our peers across the rest of FCDO and by the Nepalis and by other donors? And already DFID had a sort of a reputation as someone who was investing in evidence, but in Nepal there'd been a long history of it. And it was part of how kind of people saw themselves. And so when the merger came, DFID and the Foreign Office being merged together, there was this real opportunity actually to create a feeling, a culture that the kind of the USP for the FCDO in Nepal was around using evidence and using evidence to understand the impact of the portfolio. So that's one thing I think. The second is kind of less less prosaic, I suppose, and just about systems and processes. And, you know, kind of people have talked about this already, but just like physically, you know, who sits on a board and how do those decisions get made and how does evidence go into that? And so a lot of that was around, for example, bringing in external academic voices to some of those conversations where perhaps the evidence maybe isn't quite ready, but at least we can get some challenge. And then the third and final area is around resourcing. And I think it was, you know, it's maybe slightly easier being in a position where you both love evidence and you have some control over the money, but to pay people to actually do research and evidence uptake is just really helps, right? And I think it's a bit like, you know, NORAD. I mean, I think it just feels like, you know, NORAD is really visible and like focused on evidence now in a way, right? And just doing stuff. And there is something about having a sufficient number of people who are working on this stuff, who are busy and who care about it to make it successful. All right, I'll stop there and then shall I talk about how it all went completely wrong? And everybody go, no, do you want me to talk about challenges? Yeah. Yeah, all right. I hadn't actually prepared this bit. I have to look at my notes now. So I came up with three challenges. So the first thing was that this was the kind of plan that I had, and it sort of was going quite well. And then there was Odekut's COVID, and you know, there's been some quite big political changes in Nepal as well. And actually, none of what we really did was able to withstand that, to be honest. And so it set us back 9 months. And what we had to do was to think about the systems and processes that would support evidence in a crisis. And I'll just give one example of what I found personally really difficult and challenging was around evidence on school opening. So at the time, when COVID hit, it wasn't really clear what the evidence was or what really the right options were. But what took us maybe kind of 9 months to get that back on track and being able to bring evidence to the Nepal government about the damaging impact of school closures on children, just didn't work and just didn't land. Schools stayed closed until February last year, and have had a hugely negative impact on children. And so I kind of reflected on that, and I think it's this kind of point about the sort of individual evidence use versus the sort of portfolio approach. Success is about being really clear that whenever we're making a decision, we're bringing the best available evidence into that. And sometimes there are just a set of political, cultural things that just trump that. And as long as that decision is transparent, then I think that's fine. Well, yeah. doesn't feel fine at the time, right? It really doesn't, right? Yeah. And then so the last thing I then wanted to say is just I think it's really about kind of persistence and incremental change. I think a lot of this, if you look kind of where we've come from and wherever, I'm looking at Berta, the first systematic review ever in the world in 1970 or something. We've come a long way. We've come a long way from there, but it does take time.